we'll be looking at the poem, The Courage That My Mother Had, and the story, Uncle Randolph's Buried Treasure. You'll find these on pages 509 through 518. So first we'll look at the poem. This poem, you'll notice, is written in 3 stanzas of 4 lines each. And a stanza is kind of like how a story would use paragraphs. And since the stanzas are organized into 4 lines, we call it a quatrain. You'll maybe notice if you look at the last word in each stanza, you'll see that the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, but this one is a little bit tricky. The first stanza has what we call a slant rhyme, and it's a imperfect or near rhyme. So this is line 1, you have had, and line 3, queried. So this is not a true rhyme, but it kind of has a similar sound since they both end in a D. But we're still going to call it A, B, A, B rhyme scheme. And then the third stanza has an I rhyme. So line 2 says grave, and line 4 says have. And you'll notice these look like they rhyme, but when you say it, instead of grave, have, or grab, have, they don't sound exactly right, but to your eye they look like a rhyme. So even though we have these two kind of strange rhymes, we still would say A, B, A, B. Now in this poem, the poet is talking about how her mother gave her a brooch, which is a type of jewelry, and even though she really values the brooch, the thing that she would have rather had from her mother is her mother's courage. And obviously, courage is a lot more useful than a piece of jewelry. So her mother had a lot of courage, and the poet doesn't really feel like she has courage. And we can see that the mother has passed away, and the daughter is kind of just remembering her. And she compares her mother's courage to granite. And granite is formed under pressure, and courage is something that's strong under pressure, right? Somebody who's courageous is strong when there's a lot of pressure on them. Also, the mother comes from the east side of the United States called New England, and New England uses a lot of granite. Um, then at the end of the poem, they mention a granite hill, and this is just a graveyard, right? A lot of times they'll use granite in making gravestones. So Granite Hill is a graveyard. All right, now Uncle Randolph's buried treasure. So this story is told in a flashback. At the very beginning of the story, he's going back to his grandmother's house and talking about the house. They're about to sell it. And then after about the first paragraph, he talks about a memory from childhood, the only other time that he visited his grandmother's house. So at the very beginning of the story, the first paragraph, it talks about how Charles is going back to his grandmother's old house, and he kind of describes the house. He said it felt depressed, or he expected to feel depressed. The air smelled ancient and sterile. The furniture looked ghostly under sheets furred with thick dust, and the garden had fallen into desolation of weeds. So he's talking about kind of this very depressing feeling, right? And it's a kind of a comparison between how his grandmother's house looked years and years later and how he felt as a child living in his grandmother's house. So he had gone there most likely during one of the world wars. It was common at the time for parents to send their children far away from Europe to a place that was safe. And so it seems like maybe his grandmother lived in the United States or somewhere else that was not in the middle of the war, right? So he would be safer. And so it's set during that time. He's alone with his grandmother, who's quite old and just not a lot of fun, right? She can't hear very well. She doesn't enjoy little kids, I think. And his life is kind of boring, depressing, right? So this is the setting of the story. And we know that his uncle comes, and he is a more fun person, right? And he tells Charles eventually about this buried treasure, and they go on this treasure hunt to find the buried treasure. So I want to point out a few things the author uses. He uses two examples of hyperbole or exaggeration. When he's talking about how his parents are thousands of miles away in a place called Europe, he says, and it seemed improbable to him that they would ever return. So obviously they went back home, but as a child, it seems like it's never going to happen. So it's kind of an exaggeration here that it's never going to happen, but that's how he feels. And then later, at the very end of the story, when his uncle is trying to justify why he made up this whole story about the treasure, he says that lying to Charles is not as bad as letting him die of boredom. And obviously, Charles would not have died of boredom. This is an exaggeration. So the author also uses personification when describing Uncle Randolph under the umbrella. It says the umbrella waved about uncertainly, made up its mind, and floated across the street. And this is obviously Uncle Charles holding the umbrella, but it seemed to Charles as if the umbrella itself was doing all this. And then we have onomatopoeia, which is a sound word, right? And it says a bell jingled, and the jingled is the sound word. All right, so as the story goes, Uncle Randolph is telling Charles about this treasure, right? And we start to get hints that there really isn't a buried treasure, or it's not real, right? It's made up. And here are some of the things that give us clues. So, first of all, he mentions the buried treasure, but it's quite a long time until they finally go search for the map, right? So that kind of gives you a little suspicion that maybe Uncle Randolph had to come up with a map, right, and have some ideas. Then Uncle Randolph tells Charles not to tell grandmother about it, which is again a bit suspicious. And then when they go look for the map, when Charles starts to look, he quickly finds the map, right? So like one of the first places he looks, he finds the map. And then Uncle Randolph sneaks off all by himself early in the morning with a shovel to the island. And he tells Charles, he acts really weird and suspicious about it, but then he tries to tell Charles, well, I was just scouting out to see if it's like where we think it is. But now we can, like looking back, we can think that probably Uncle Randolph went to bury the treasure. So then, when Charles is getting excited about the treasure, Uncle Randolph warns him that it's a modest treasure, that the pirate wasn't a rich man, but so just kind of to lower his expectations that they're not going to be rich when they find this treasure. So that's again suspicious. And then when they go and they dig up the treasure, Charles describes the box with the metal on the box as looking quite new, right? And if something had been buried for a long, long time, the metal would be really, really old looking, right? So again, very suspicious. And then at the end of the story, there's a very heated argument between the grandmother and Uncle Randolph, and that obviously it tells us that the grandmother is upset about it, and she does not think that Uncle Randolph should have lied to Charles about the treasure. And at the end, Charles still believes that the treasure is real and the bad guy is real. He still believes it. And so it's fine to make believe things and to pretend things, but it seems like Uncle Charles could have done it without actually telling a lie. And as an adult, when Charles looks back, he knows he can understand that it was all fake, but it did give him something fun to do while he was staying with his grandmother. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Just let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.